Hello and welcome to ATARC's Accelerating Government IT Modernization with Cloud Virtual Summit. For those who do not know, my name is Kirsten Patton and I'm the Working Group Program Manager here at ATARC, and I will be emceeing and moderating today's summit. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and we are a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. Thank you to our partners over at MongoDB, AWS, and Carahsoft for helping us create today's summit. Additionally, I would like to thank you all at home for joining us. We hope that you enjoy this informative session, and we would also like to remind you that after each panel, there will be time for Q&A. So please place all of your Q&A in the box down below your screen. I would also like to encourage you to answer the poll questions throughout each session in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credits. Now, up first, we have our visionary keynote, the Chief Information Officer for the Office of the Secretary within the Department of Commerce, Dr. Lawrence Anderson. Dr. Anderson, over to you, please.
Unmuted. Can everybody hear me this morning?
Yes.
Give me a thumbs up. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for ATARC for allowing me the opportunity to address this group today. As I was thinking about the topic that I wanted to talk about, and this is, I wanted to, obviously it's in the form of, in the realm of cloud adoption, but I think about my experiences over the last 10 years in terms of the cloud adoption and what have been the challenges, the biggest challenges associated with us either adopting cloud or adopting agile methodologies, going to DevSecOps. What have been the biggest real challenges? And I thought about that over the last couple of weeks. It's really about the culture in the organization itself and making the case for why cloud in the first place. So I'll talk about a little bit about when I first got to the Department of Commerce, and we were in the midst of, and still in the midst of, a transformation effort, both in terms of beginning our digital transformation effort, but also having some real challenges modernizing our legacy infrastructure. But one of the things that I encountered early on is my own team's resistance toward actually adopting a cloud mindset, or a cloud first, or eventually as OMB eventually got to a cloud smart mindset. And because they haven't adopted that, what I learned is that the opportunities for actually adopting and modernizing and moving toward the cloud in a more efficient, faster way, or just accelerating that cloud adoption, was only being driven from me and the ideas that I came up with. But if you're trying to really move this thing along, it can't be just a top-down approach. You have to have, you have to engage the minds of multiple people in your organization about why it's the best way to go. Why should we be doing this? Why is this the next, just a newfangled thing going from on-prem to cloud? Why do we need to do this? And so I'm talking to you today about what my tactic has been, or strategy has been over the last, I guess, 2 years, actually multiple years, but most intently in the last 18 months, is really making the case that this is where we need to go. This is where the industry is going. This is that makes the most sense for the Department of Commerce in particular, in terms of why we need to be here. So we start talking about different use cases that we have and different problems that we've had in our organization in terms of outages and just availability of systems, and frankly, just the challenge associated with finding the right personnel, given the difficulty of recruiting people who actually happen to have the skill sets who actually support the infrastructure. I'll just say that, whether it be networks, whether it be servers, or be databases, finding capable people in this crowded marketplace, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area, but across the country, is very, very difficult. So, that's one of the challenges, that we can't continue to keep up with the Amazons and Googles of the world in terms of attracting that talent. We have to kind of buy that talent that's already out there rather than try to compete internally, because we just can't keep up. And so we start talking about, and I started talking to them about just real world scenarios, like what does this really look like? And if we were to continue to do what we're doing in terms of every time there's a new application, we're building a new on-premise services, whether it be the production environments, the test environments, the UAT environments, the development environments, all these environments associated with deploying a system or an application, and of course the technologies and of course the amount of technology that we're continuing to have and the growth of our data center with multiple servers, either be physical or virtual, and they continue to pile up. We just can't sustain this over time. And so it was making the case with the team that we have to go in a different direction. That was really the beginning point of saying, hey, we got to stop doing what we're doing, because basically this is the definition of insanity, to keep on doing what we're doing in terms of continuing to rely on legacy technology or legacy thinking in terms of how we deploy technology. So that was the first thing, for making the case about why we need to be different and why we need to do something different. And then there's this, you get to a point where you need to talk about, okay, well, what do we do? And this is what, really the part of the conversation I really wanted to have with you today. What do you do with the team that you already have? Even if they kind of buy into the idea that you need to adopt, to go to a cloud infrastructure, whether it be, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and even network as a service, because those are things we're considering now at the Department of Commerce. What does that mean for your existing staff and your existing team? And what are we going to do? What are our strategies are we going to do to retrain them in areas that they need to kind of be in this new paradigm that we're going to, where we are going to more of a managed service type of environment, rather than building these infrastructure or what I call commodity IT services in-house. We're going to be buying these things or managing these services externally. What does that look like for us? And so, this is where the rubber meets the road, because we had to have some really difficult conversations about the fact that there's no path, at least a growth path, for a system administrator, in the organization anymore. Or a network engineer or network administrators in the organization. We're consolidating those things, but we need to figure out what the growth path would be for people, for an organization that's now fully adopting, a cloud, mantra in terms of moving to the cloud. And so this means that we're retraining people, but not just retraining them, but getting them to see how they can actually be useful to the organization, to the world of the Department of Commerce in a different way. Because effectively they've grown up in the technology field with being hands-on, whether it be configuring routers, switches, firewalls, or Linux servers or Windows servers or what have you, or managing SQL or Oracle databases. We've had hands-on people, and that's how they've grown up in the world of IT for years. And now taking somebody who's been doing something like this for 15 years and having that person transition to kind of an oversight person, where we are now asking and requiring for all of our people, in the organization to have core certifications. So your folks in the private sector, that's contractor officers representative certification. So they're able to oversee the work of others. They also have to have advanced project management skills that they hadn't had before, because these are the kind of skill sets that we need for us to provide the appropriate oversight for the managed services paradigm that we're actually going to. So we also had to talk about the different types of cloud models that are out there, because frankly, when I got there, I had to stop a number of projects that were moving to the cloud to check a kind of box, but they didn't understand that we were going to spend more money in the cloud, because they're effectively doing a lift and shift of what was on premise to the cloud itself. So educating my team about the different models of the cloud and how we will actually go to the cloud in a very smart way, rather than just trying to do a straight lift and shift, as some entities have done, and we were basically going down that road also. And it wasn't going to get us the savings that we wanted. It wasn't going to give us the resiliency that we wanted, because effectively it would have kept our team members doing the same things they were doing on premise, with the exception of the fact that these things are now in the cloud. But it really doesn't change the fundamental model that we would have had if we would have gone to a cloud as an infrastructure as a service a type system, or a type of paradigm. So, I won't speak too much on this, too much further, but I wanted to get your minds thinking about your human aspect of going to the cloud and accelerating the cloud. We lose sight of that a lot, and we come up with these great ideas, and we need to go to the cloud, and we got to do this, but we don't think too much about the people that we got we have to have in our existing organization. And this is a kind of a people leadership type of question, but still a really important question that we got to deal with, because frankly, we got a lot of people who basically grew up in a on-premise legacy type of environment, and we have to make the case to them that this is the way we need to be going, not just because the bosses said that we want to go to the cloud, not because OMB says cloud first and then cloud smart, but because it makes the right business case for us to be doing that. And I'm talking about the business of IT. It makes the most business sense in terms of the business of IT. But we have to make that case first. And then we have to provide a path for them to go. How, what's the path for a network engineer, in an environment where we don't need necessarily networks as much as we used to, or network support like we used to anymore? What's the path for a server administrator who used to administer Linux servers or Windows servers, or Unix or Solaris servers? What's the path for that? And there are some paths, right? And we've started to lay some things out in terms of creating a path, essentially a pathway for the different types of skill sets we have in the organization. If I had more time, I would kind of show you how we did that, but we kind of laid out the kind of the job series that we have today. And it basically was an as is in terms of what the skill sets we have in terms of what we do today. And if we were to do, go fully to the cloud and adopt a cloud mantra across the board, what would the organization need to look like in terms of the skill sets? And then how do we transition? What types of people do we need to transition to this role, So some folks, you would transition from server administration to cloud engineers. Others would transition to being, the overseers of our network as a service, which we're about to get into in a larger way at the Department of Commerce. Some would transition into roles of project management or program management, but it would be definitely different in terms of what they do today. This doesn't mean they're not technical and they don't need to keep their technical skills up to par, because they actually have to be more technical, because they need to actually be able to oversee the work of others. But it's really important that we make the case first, that we provide a ramp way for them to get from this point to this point. But the key point, as I started this conversation, is that you got to make that case, because they're going to think of better ways to get there than you can by yourself. You got to get your team, convinced that this is the way to go, because the opportunities for acceleration is not just going to be with you. It's going to be with the people who are down in the weeds, who are doing the work and see that this can be done in a better way. This can be moved to the cloud, and we can do it cheaper, faster, and better by going to the cloud, by going down the cloud road for the specific set of applications that we currently support today on-prem. So with that, I kind of end this, at least in this part of the opening conversation. Thank you for allowing me to speak here, and I'm looking forward to having further conversations about this. But my key point I want to leave you with is really focus on the people aspect of this. The technology is great, but I think for you folks in the DoD world, you talk about people, process, technology. I'm a firm believer in that. The people, processes, and technology. We put technology first, but we really need to be thinking about the people first, then the processes, and then technology, in that order in my mind, because that's going to really get you to a place that you want to go in terms of modernization, in terms of transformation, in terms of anything that you're trying to get to. You have to really focus on who you got and how you get them from point A to point B. Just like a project, you have to think of your people, in terms of building their skill sets also to get you where you want to go as an organization. It's a huge challenge, and it takes some time and a commitment from you as a leader and the organization. But that's but it's a reality of something you have to deal with, because we're not the private sector where we can just cut off whole segments of people. We have people that we have to employ and have to have them gainfully employed to do something to move us along, and we have to provide a pathway for them. So I'll stop there, and again, I thank ATARC for allowing me to at least start this conversation off today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. That was awesome. We really appreciate you taking the time to come speak with us. All right, up next, we have our first panel of the day. So again, I want to encourage the audience at home, please send your questions in as they come up and we'll definitely prioritize those. But at this point, I would love if our panelists could please come on camera. And I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves. We'll give them a minute here. All right, so we'll start with Greg since I see him on camera first. Greg, please go ahead and introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your agency, and anything that you'd like our audience to know up top.
Okay, first of all, you can all call me Skip. Everybody knows me as Skip. I can tell if it's a cold call from a vendor because they ask for Greg. But anyway, I work for the Census Bureau, U.S. Census Bureau, and we are aggressively moving toward the cloud. We already have a number of things in the cloud. We're dealing with a lot of the same issues that Dr. Anderson talked about. I concur with his comments, and the people are very important. We have a very aggressive training program that we're engaged in. And I think his comments were fair about the progression in the federal government from cloud first to cloud smart. Those that were involved in federal government, 12 years ago or so, people were just throwing everything up in the cloud, and a lot of people had to pull some of it back because it was more expensive and wasn't taking advantage of the cloud. So I think it's very important to understand the technical and business advantages of the cloud and make sure that you're focusing your migration on the things that matter most, with that the cloud will help the most, as opposed to just whatever's convenient. And you'll find that some of your legacy things may never get to the cloud. They'll be rewritten or redone in the cloud. They're not going to migrate. So I think it's being smart about it, but having it as a focus so that that the momentum gets there, and then convincing everybody that it's usually the business isn't hard to convince as it is the technical people. The business get on a plane or talk to their friends and they're like, how come we're not all in the cloud? Why do we have a data center? Those are the kinds of questions that you get, I'm sure. So agree with it. And we're also facing, and I'll talk about this more when I get a chance, but we're facing, as the largest statistical agency in the federal government, we're facing survey weariness by the public. And so we're having to look at new sources of data, which is an important step for us. And I'll mention that later in some of the questions.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. Next, Ryan.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Korn. So I'm at the Bureau of Industry and Security in Department of Commerce, the Senior Architect and Product Manager for Data Solutions there. There are a couple things that I would say as far as modernizing applications in the cloud, and sort of best practices, what makes the most sense in my experience, a lot of which actually was at Sba, which I won't talk in too much detail about because I know that Keith is going to be talking about that in a bit. And I don't want to steal his thunder. But I would say that there are a couple factors to consider when deciding whether to either build on-prem, build in the cloud, or migrate from on-premise to the cloud, or just redesign natively in the cloud. The first is speed to delivery. There are a lot of COTS solutions out there that do a lot of what we really need to do as government in terms of workflows, design, database. A lot of government processes are just data in, some kind of transformation, and data out. So in a lot of cases, if you're dealing with a simple application, it makes a lot of sense to just rewrite that in a cloud native solution rather than to migrate it over, because it actually would take much less time to do that because there's just so much to build on that's just commercially available right off the bat. The second thing that I would talk about is modularity and extensibility for reuse. I think that's just, like I said, all across the board, a lot of business processes are very similar to each other. But what ends up happening is when an application is developed, custom, whether that's in the cloud or on premise, right? You end up in a situation where everything is self-contained within that application, and it's much more difficult to reuse. So by building it in a cloud platform that promotes sharing, extensibility, reusability, you're actually driving down costs and further driving down the speed to delivery. And then the last thing I would really want to mention is the focus on customer experience and those sorts of user-focused, human-centered design that are enabled by cloud technologies. I think the old way of doing things, just from a mindset perspective, you could still do this in the cloud, right? As infrastructure as a service in Azure, AWS, wherever. I think the conventional technical thought process is, well, let's look at the data requirement, and then we build the application on top of that, and then sort of the interface becomes a bit of an afterthought. With cloud solutions, because so much of the database is already built out or abstracted, similarly because of so many capabilities that can be used at the application layer, workflows, those sorts of things, then the focus really becomes on the customer experience and sort of using that sort of design to drive to drive application development. And so it puts the business unit in the driver's seat rather than the other way around, putting the technical folks in the driver's seat. And the value prop there is that you've got, theoretically, if we're doing it the right way, business units that are much more engaged, that have a much clearer understanding of what they're going to get out of the process at the end game, because they're not sort of dealing with abstract terms and data tables and that sort of thing that they're not really attuned to in the same way that technical folks are. So that speed to delivery, modularity, and customer experience, I think, are the three biggest things that really are enabled by the cloud. And then the question just becomes, okay, what is the best strategy? What is the best technology? And then I think, to Greg's point, is it worth it, right? Doing that calculation once you do that evaluation across your applications. So really appreciate speaking with you all and answering questions as they come up, and turn it over back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those insights with us. Over to Keith next.
Yeah, thank you for having us on board this morning. Keith Bluestein at the SBA. And again, as Ryan indicated, we worked together previously. I had kind of a unique situation in that I joined after the pandemic, in the response to the pandemic, and people are probably familiar that we kind of became supersized overnight with doing a lot of the relief activity in there, and we were required to expand our capability suite in relatively quick order. Now, fortunately for us, it's interesting listening to Dr. Anderson earlier, where there was a lot of lift and shift, if you will, in our organization that had been done as previous work. There'd been an imperative, let's move as much as we can to the cloud, and they had done a lot of that activity. And fortunately, we had a presence in the cloud when all of the pandemic hit, so that we had the extensibility or the scalability to some extent in order to actually deliver on some of those needs. But it does highlight one of the things that I dealt with when I came in then was kind of some budget issues related to that. So it's great when you have things on-prem because you can control that. You're paying electricity, whatever you may be paying, but if you don't use those services, you're just paying for the electricity to keep some steel platters spinning in there. When you're paying for things in the cloud, every second that you're consuming something, that is costing you some money. So I came in and we started taking a look at, okay, how is the best rational approach to actually continue to deliver services, but try to decrement those things that are just consuming dollars without necessarily purpose. And I only bring that up, not necessarily as a critique. It was a good thing that we actually shifted to the cloud. But my point is that in the longer arc of these things, we need to take a look at, okay, how do we get to the cloud? We talk about cloud smart, but what is the logical path to get there? Are there certain things that can go naturally in there, or do we build it in there, as Ryan indicated earlier? Or is there some mix of those two things? And we really need to orchestrate that. I think in a perfect world, you orchestrate a lot of those things before you go in there. There's a tremendous advantage to having these things in the cloud, and that you have this scalability and agility. And the way that we are operating now, government has traditionally been a little bit slower than the commercial field, but we're being expected to deliver at the rate of the commercial field. And the only way that we're going to really do that in government, I think, is to get to the point where you have that agility and you can actually move on the fly. And that really goes to one of Ryan's points about one of the things that we're doing internal to SBA is we want to shift to a platform approach to everything that we deliver, rather than taking a look at specific applications. And we want one of those, two of those, and bringing those things into our environment and operating that way. We're really taking a look at, if we want to leverage our data, we want to give a better customer experience to people. We want to standardize everything we can, if you will, at the platform and below. That includes all of your data. so that now when we're actually delivering applications, we can deliver those in either no code or low code environments where it's relatively lean. We can respond very, very quickly to give point design solutions in there. So that's kind of a pretty seismic shift. And when you sit there and take a look at, okay, how do I get there? We go back to Dr. Anderson's concerns about, okay, how do we get the right skill sets in that arena in order to be able to deliver that? To some extent, we'll probably have to get support from vendors and other folks, but as we grow over time, I think that we are going to move away from the traditional parentheticals or the IT specialists that we've hired in government and go towards these people that ideally are able to kind of switch on the fly or have that kind of critical thinking where what is the better solution that can actually develop on top of the platform. So it's a pretty complex environment, but the potential is certainly there. And I think that going back to my point about the speed that is required to service the taxpayer, small businesses, the economy demands that we have to be much more responsive than we have traditionally been in government. And that's a cultural shift. So thank you. Stand by for other comments.
Thank you. And then we're going to go over to Brent. Brent for intro.
Sorry, my on a little bit of a lag there. Brent Leach here with MongoDB. So I'm representing industry, I guess, since I am not a government employee. But the viewpoint that I have comes from the fact that I get to see a lot of programs, a lot of projects, a lot of agencies along this path, and we get to from the outside look to see what has been successful and what has not. So from that perspective, I was making this analogy just earlier this week that if everyone's riding horses, horse paths are fine. But the Romans realized they needed to move a lot further, a lot faster, so they built their network of roads, which allowed them to conquer a vast portion of the planet. If you're putting your Tesla on those Roman roads, it's not going to go great. We're moving into the more modern organizations where you need the infrastructure to be able to handle the workload that is required for government to properly address the needs of the citizenry. So those Roman roads may work, but they're probably not going to work as well as the 6 lanes of blacktop that those vehicles are designed for. Similarly, the infrastructure that currently exists in government is not sufficient for moving to the cloud and working at the speed and with the requirements that government agencies have today. Hopefully that analogy is apt. I tend to speak in analogies, so I hope it is. The real impact here is if you're not thoughtfully going to the cloud, you might be making yourself more inefficient than you are efficient. Is really the viewpoint that me and many of my colleagues on the vendor side see when we're working with the and trying to assist the government agencies in modernizing and becoming more and more efficient and move faster. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for those intros and starting us off right. We're going to now pop up our first poll question of the day before we dive into more specific questions around the topic. So how familiar are you with your agency's strategies for migrating to the cloud? And just as a reminder, those at home, please answer this if you'd like to receive your CPE credit. And with that said, I'm going to start asking certain panelists questions, but as a little housekeeping, if you want to answer that as well, just come off mute so that I know that you would like to respond to the same question. But with that, we'll go back around the same order, starting with Skip. And Skip, I'd like to ask you, what are some best strategies for switching from on-premise to the public cloud?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I would say to that. First of all, and I mentioned this, choosing the either platforms or environments that will give you the best results in the cloud is very important. And so if you have, for example, something that runs 24/7, large data set, and you can't it really can't be broken up, shut off. It just keeps going. Maybe not a great choice to start with. You want to pick things that are more discrete, that have maybe cycles in them. I think those become some of the keys. And then it's also very important to understand what you can use cloud native tools for versus what you cannot, and where the advantages of those cloud native tools are. We originally started down this path trying to be very vendor agnostic and trying to protect ourselves from vendor lock. And I think we've really made a shift in that area and saying, okay, we're willing to use cloud native tools. We're still multi-cloud, but we're willing to use the cloud native tools because it gives us so much more agility and speed. And we may have to redo that in the other cloud that we're using or do it somewhere else, but the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And so I think looking at cloud native tools is also another key when you're looking at what to use.
Great, thank you. And then over to Ryan next. Why is modernizing cloud applications important for the federal cloud government?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons why you would want to modernize your application versus just do a lift and shift. As I mentioned earlier, I think that the biggest thing from my perspective is that human-centered design aspect that can be brought to it. You know, if you have the opportunity to take an application that's, you know, oftentimes dealing in government, something that was built in the 90s or you know, early 2000s, something that's 15 to 20 years old. Oh, here's my cat joining the panel as well. You've got something that's, you know, you've got an opportunity to take an experience that was designed 15, 20 years ago and bring it up to modern standards so that both your internal and external customers feel like that they have a government and technical services that are responsive to them. So, you know, even separate from the cloud arguments, separate from the, you know, the cost arguments, separate from like policy directive, I think really putting on a good coat of paint is really important too, because that's how folks engage with the services. They just see that front end. I think the other thing that's super important is, you know, as both Greg and Keith had alluded to, is that time to delivery, the speed, the agility. That's just, you know, of paramount importance given the demands that we're facing. You know, I'm sure Keith can talk to some of the COVID experiences that we had at SBA, but there were some things that were happening incredibly quickly. So one example that I like to cite is Sba.gov. That was led by Ryan Hillard. He's a program manager at SBA, phenomenal guy. But when the president tweeted about SBA, there was more traffic that went to the SBA's website than ever before by like a 50-fold increase. And because they had built the new Sba.gov on the cloud infrastructure instead of on-premise infrastructure, they were able to handle that load, and to the point where, because they had set up their website caching in such a way that could handle that additional load, the load times actually went down because more folks were accessing the service. And so, you know, if you were to just port over, you know, if you were just port over the website or port over an application, and all of a sudden you saw a 25 to 50 times surge in demand, which is something that SBA saw in the early days of the pandemic, and in many ways continues to this day. You know, that just simply would not have been possible if you were relying on the old architecture, even within the cloud, without like an extensive amount of maintenance and support and additional thought put into it. So, you know, I think that looking at the customer experience and the scalability, those are just two huge things that, you know, odds are, if you're just doing a lift and shift, you're not going to be able to get with the existing application as it was designed, like I said, 15 or 20 years ago.
Great. Keith, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Sure, I'll build on the example that Ryan demonstrated. I think the numbers were, you know, your average concurrent users on Sba.gov prior to the president tweeting was like 6,000 to 7,000, and within 3 minutes is up to 93,000 concurrent users. And you didn't get, you know, if you'd done that on a lot of websites, you'd have gotten something that said that the resource wasn't available or something like that. But SBA didn't hiccup. I mean, it handled all that, including all of the data requests that went through there. And that was because, as Ryan indicated, it was built from the ground up to handle that. That elasticity and scalability is what the cloud brings you. And so when we talk about kind of doing new application development, when you look at the old things, if you will, if we've lifted and shifted, if you will, you've bought technical debt in that. The way it was designed originally, you got a boat anchor that it's dragging along there. If you just bring it into the cloud, when you actually develop cloud native, you can do things, first of all, in a very efficient fashion, but even more importantly, to Ryan's point, is that we can create it in a fashion such that that customer experience is optimized. And we really want to look at it. This is one of the things that we're really pushing hard here, is that we want everything to be designed from the eyes of the consumer. When they're actually trying to use this, how is it actually functioning? So when we look at being able to develop in the cloud, we can eliminate anything that's kind of dragging us behind or holding us back in there. And I think it just provides an optimized experience. And additionally, the other things, if you want to leverage things like data, et cetera, if we only have to design certain things, again, I go back to our website development, Sba.gov, there's only certain components that you have to worry about if you're doing certain functions. So now we're just worrying about those particular elements and optimizing those things without having to do all the other technical stack that would go along with some of the other applications.
Great, thank you for that. Let's pop up poll number 2 real quickly, please. I'll go ahead and read it. It's going to be, in your opinion, what is the biggest barrier to migrating to the cloud? There it is. Options include short-term targets, organization culture, data loss and leakage risks, compliance concerns, incompatibility with traditional security networks, and lack of human resource or other. So please take a moment and respond to that. And on a similar note, Brent, I would like to hear from you on this. What are some of the challenges of modernizing cloud applications?
So what we see for most of our clients, one of the larger blockers is that data is very siloed. It's in inaccessible places, and everyone's got a little fiefdom of data, and they don't want to share it with others. You run into some of that, but sometimes it's technologically impossible to share. Many of the data platforms that are in use were architected 40, 50, sometimes 60 years ago. And it's just a very old style. It's not designed for modern applications. It's not designed to respond to how applications are architected. It's not designed for how developers think. It's not designed for how data scientists think. It's designed for how database administrators think. And they used to be the long pole in the tent. It used to be the database administrators were the expensive component for all of IT. They were by far the largest bottleneck. What we see now, it's actually developer time is a much larger bottleneck. So if the agency needs a deliverable, if they need something, and they're driving toward that, the delays is often developer time. When the data is siloed and they can't get and the data is not easy to work with, because the folks coming out of college now don't know a lot about rows and columns. They know about objects, right? It's a completely different mind shift from when I was a developer many years ago. It's difficult, and it slows things down tremendously. And when you aren't getting value out of this great new project that you've got, and you've spent the money and you've pitched the project, and the government's green lit the project, and it's moving forward, and the value is delayed, it's a massive hit to continuing on that path of legacy modernization, moving to the cloud, and then it tends to snowball, and it slows further and further projects down. So I would, obviously, my expertise is on the data side. That would be my view.
Thank you. Looks like Elizabeth, watching our panel, she agrees with you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Ryan, I see you came off mute. Did you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I wanted to add, I thought it was really interesting what you were talking about, Brent. And I think also, just looking at the poll response, where 45% of folks said that organizational culture was the biggest challenge, right? I mean, that speaks to what we were saying earlier about technology not really being the problem so much. It's the people and the processes. And so, I think that part of the challenge of migrating to the cloud, whether you're doing lift and shift or regardless of what platforms or products you're using, aside from building the organizational culture, is building that DevOps operational model where you're able to go from requirements to design to validation to development and then ongoing consistent iterative releases. So you've got that agile development cycle. I think that's really hard for organizations, particularly if you're switching from a waterfall mindset, or if you're in been developing a certain way for 15, 20 years or more because you're maintaining applications, or if you've got that really high boundary between development and security and operations. Without that kind of consistent model, I don't think you're going to be able to take advantage of all that the cloud has to offer, and really all that the people have to offer as well, because there's going to be so much wasted effort without those processes in place. And so part of that is organizational culture, and then part of that is how do you then use that new methodology to apply everybody's skills and capabilities to cloud development. But I think that that's a significant challenge.
Skip, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I'm sure Ryan intended this, but it really needs to be a DevSecOps emphasis, not just DevOps, because especially as you go into the cloud, the security part becomes very critical that you have an integrated approach. It also is opportunities for saving a lot of money and things like ATOs and having a much tighter security profile. So I think as you build that in instead of add it on, it really becomes critical.
All right, thank you all for those responses. So next I want to talk about the benefit of modernizing cloud applications rather than a lift and shift. But before we do that, Keith, can you help explain the differences between the lift and shift versus the modernization of cloud applications?
Yeah, for me, lift and shift is, we can create a lot of things that are in that virtual environment. We've heard of things like digital twins, et cetera. So there's very little that we have that we can't just replicate into a digital construct and then place in the cloud. And as I mentioned earlier, back in the days when we did, for instance, we developed an application and it may have been served up on a particular server. We did everything from that server piece to the data piece, to the application piece, to how it was actually interfacing with a customer. And that came in that entire stack. And so in a lift and shift environment, a lot of times you're just converting all that digitally, if you will, and putting it in the cloud. So if it wasn't optimized previously, or time has changed and it's not optimized for how the customer wants to interact, all you've done is you've put that in a cloud environment as opposed to your on-prem environment. Whereas if we do modernization, as we were alluding to earlier, for instance, not to beat the drum on Sba.gov, but certain other applications that are out there, those things can be we can take a look at how is that interacting with the customer? Do we have the opportunity to access other data sources, et cetera, to bring things to bear? And if you look at things, for instance, like whether it's Amazon or Netflix, they have graceful degradation in there where they design these applications, or what you see, such that if a data source goes down, you don't notice that data source is no longer available, whether it was product description, something like that. It automatically reformats. And so that's all a function of what did we actually design for the customer to see. So that's truly the benefit, I think, when you get into designing in the cloud or modernizing those applications, is you can give that better customer experience and making sure that you're serving up the things that you want to serve up in the process.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, and I think totally agree with what Keith has said, is that when you lift and shift, you can think of the cloud as just being like somebody else's data center. I mean, really the cloud is just like it's Amazon's data center, or Google or Microsoft. And all you're doing is just having them do it, but you're doing everything that you did before. You're not taking advantage of the real benefits of the cloud, the tools and the opportunity to, as Keith has alluded to, Brent's alluded to, Ryan's alluded to, with the cloud, you have so many things that are taken care of for you. And you can that allows you to focus on these other things that, like Keith mentioned, in terms of user experience and how you deliver things. And so it's really, I think there's miles apart between the two.
Thank you. And then Brent, what cost savings does this bring?
Well, there's tremendous, if it's done properly, cost savings in all areas. I mean, it should be cheaper on the people side. It should be cheaper in many of the tech, especially when you're retiring the legacy tech. A lot of that's very expensive to maintain. You may see an increase in actually you should see an increase in what you're spending with those cloud vendors, but you're reallocating a lot of the resources that you're retiring. So it's only natural to see the increase in your cloud spend as you move more things to the cloud. But your traditional infrastructure spend should drastically decrease. But it's not just cost savings. You're able to do a whole lot more and able to serve the citizenry in a much more modern way. So there's some benefits there as well. So there are hard dollar savings, there's some soft dollar savings, but realistically there are increases depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
If I could just add, I think it's important. One of the challenges we have because of the tyranny of the urgent a lot of times in developing and actually pushing these things out, we don't do as good a job oftentimes as doing the accounting, because I think that's really important. So after the fact, sometimes, okay, well, what did you save? Or, what's the benefit? Sometimes it's hard after the fact if we didn't set up that accounting beforehand to make sure that we could report appropriately. So then it just becomes okay, well, so what? Now, I might have done a lot of great things behind the scenes, but if I can't take accounting of that I saved X amount, or it's just much more efficient, it becomes a little bit of a challenge.
It's interesting that you say that, because we see it all the time where folks don't take their initial assessment. It's hard to see what you've saved if you don't take an accurate initial assessment of really what you're spending. A lot of times the initial spend is vastly underestimated because people really aren't looking truly at what they are spending currently. And when you get to that end state, it's hard to compare A and B when A is not accurate.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Brent. That's exactly right. You have a better idea of what you're spending now than what that total cost of ownership of your legacy system is. And so often you don't realize all this, or you don't recognize all the savings that's really there.
I think one of the other points that's important to bring up too is that without that clear accounting, whether it's before or after, it's really difficult to understand what is the use of your services, right? So that's one aspect that would be, savings in the cloud, is by saying, okay, well, we're going to turn off this particular infrastructure server at night because we know nobody's using it. You'd be able to generate savings there. But another way is to say, okay, well, here's what each of these business units are using, and oh, look at that. For example, the other SBA example, the Office of Disaster Assistance, they've surged up tens of thousands of people to be able to support the IDLE program. Well, we can then very easily turn around to them and say, hey, look, we know exactly what you're using, and so how do we share costs in a way that's more equitable for the organization, rather than just the IT shop just bearing the costs for the entire organization, even if that's not necessarily the best way to make sure that everybody's getting their bang for their buck.
And what tools are available for the accounting? Someone in the audience would like to know. I don't recall who this was meant for. Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are a number of ways when you actually provision these things, depending on which cloud environment they all have, whether it's Azure, Google, or AWS, which is the ones that I'm most familiar with, but they all have tools to actually monitor or meter usage, bandwidth, a number of different measures in there. And so what you want to do when you set those things up is actually determine, okay, what is going to be the cost per usage measure in there. So there's a number of tools. Each of the environments offer those things, and then there are other tools that are emerging, because this is not an uncommon requirement. The other tools that aggregate some of these things together, I don't have the products off the top of my head, but it's one of the things that capability is there. What's surprising, certainly in government, is a lot of times we don't use those. So my experience has been that IT bears the cost of a lot of these things. Consumption goes way up, and then we're stuck with a bill, and we didn't have the foresight to say, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to charge you 2 cents per gigabyte of transfer, whatever the case may be. But those tools are resident in most cases in the actual consoles that manage the cloud environments.
Yeah, so in the cloud, it's much easier, as you mentioned, Keith, because the tools are native and very easy to use, very easy to set up. The harder part is the on-prem, the legacy, and knowing what you've actually spent there. That takes just like digging in and figuring it out. I don't know of a tool that's comparable to what's in the cloud that you could actually leverage.
Yeah, I would also say the bigger challenge rather than the accounting system is being able to account for everything that you're trying to tally the cost of in the first place, right? Like I remember years ago we were working on the data center consolidation, DCOI, data center consolidation optimization initiative, and I'm like looking at electricity consumption reports for different data centers at SBA, and I'm just like, you know, they're up, then they're down, then they're this much that month and that much the other month. And then how many different data centers are we accounting for? Is a closet considered a data center? I mean, there are just so many little itty bitty pieces. Like we think in terms of the big like platforms or servers or applications or whatever. The reality is that, you know, as Skip and Keith have mentioned, so much goes into the cost that it's really, really difficult to tell. Whereas if you're just looking in your you know, whether it's a SaaS service and it's just like a straight up licensing cost for users and usage or storage, or whether you're looking at your IaaS costs in Azure, AWS, wherever, where you can see like per credit or per second or however the increments they measure it, you know, there's still a lot to account for, but at least that data is there and accessible and you can tie it all together. But I really would stand by this sort of inventory of costs being the bigger issue that you would face, whether on-prem or cloud, because it's just so much that goes into making all these systems work.
Yeah, if you don't have a mature system already, this becomes a journey. It's great if you run things like a business and that's how you're architected and you start that way. But if you kind of join midstream and you say, okay, here's what we're going to start doing. If we're providing services, and this is becoming much more common as we provide cloud services, you know, if we're going to provide this service, here's what we're going to charge. And in some of these cases, you just have to, it becomes a negotiation with your CFO or your consumers to figure out, okay, what are we going to charge initially? Break that down, see where that falls out, and go from there. If you don't have that mature system that you're already starting with, unfortunately, you have to make an educated guess, kind of defend your position of how much you're going to charge, and then go from there, adjust as time goes on.
Right, thank you all.
What I've seen is that there's a lot of there are varying levels of maturity in the systems. Some pieces and parts are archaic. Somebody's put some time and effort into and sort of modernized it, and everything's kind of stuck together with some bubble gum and duct tape to try to make it workable. But truly modernizing, moving to the cloud is you really have to be smart. To go back to the analogy, you can't upgrade every possible driving surface in all of Europe from those Roman roads. You've got to be smart about where you're going to put your effort and exactly where you're going to put the time and treasure to make sure that you do have a modern system.
We have a good question from Mike. He's asking, is it possible to use TEM teleco expense management tools to discover these costs? However, as Keith is alluding to, this is better done upfront and not after the fact. Any responses from our panelists?
I think that there are a number of tools. I know that, you know, especially in the telecom realm, that's always been a very useful tool. And I've been surprised being in several different agencies how infrequently it's used. You know, this is not an uncommon problem. So people have solutions out there. So I think that is a great starting point. Or again, surveying what other tools that people are using, especially when it comes to certain vendors. They know how their tool is consumed, how it's used, etc. Oftentimes they have capabilities that they'll provide as well to actually break down how people are consuming that, which then can be directed into costs.
Yeah, I think the problem is one that Ryan brought up, which is that will give you information about part of the problem. It's not going to give you information about the whole cost. It's the total cost of ownership that becomes difficult to track, especially on legacy systems that were not set up to track that from the beginning. And that's so yes, it can be a helpful tool in that discovery, but it will only give you partial information.
I think there's a cautionary tale from my long distance past when I was in DoD and we went to Navy Marine Corps intranet. And at the time that they made that determination, this is in the late 90s, they said, we're paying way too much for circuits and it takes too long to provision. We can do this a lot better ourselves. And so, of course, they set up Navy Marine Corps intranet to do all of that. They walked away from disk circuits and stood this up. And after several years, they started realizing, wow, we actually had a pretty good deal before.
All right, great audience questions. Please keep them coming before we run out of time. We'll go ahead and pop up our third poll question right now. In your opinion, how important is emerging technologies to modernizing the cloud? So please go ahead and answer that. And one of our final questions for discussion, what are the best practices for speed to mission, increased agility in a cloud environment? So let's go around and, please share something from your experience. Let's start with Brent first, please.
So you're specifically asking what technologies make the best impact?
Sorry, what are some of the best practices for speed to mission, increased agility in a cloud environment?
Sure, requirements gathering is number one. If you don't know what you're shooting for, then you're never going to hit the target. Best practices is heavy on the requirements. Coming from the vendor side, I would say that I think that consulting a trusted outside entity that has done this before is absolutely a best practice. We've seen a lot of organizations that try to go it alone, and they know their organization very well, but they don't have the experience of doing it in many other places, the visibility. So, but don't take a single vendor's word for it. I would absolutely, it's, if you're doing modifications to your house or work on your car or a health issue, get a second opinion. Most vendors are very myopic when it comes to their opinions about how things should be done. I would talk to the SI community. I would speak to the other programs and projects, not only within the agency, but other agencies as well. Most agencies fundamentally are dealing with the same issues and the same problems. And we are all together smarter than any single one of us philosophy of approaching any of these modernization efforts.
Thank you.
One thing I would add to that is that learn how to use the tools native in whatever cloud that you're using and get expert in that, because that's where the speed and agility comes. And it's a case of buy what you can, don't build everything yourself. And I'll use an example, as Keith did. In a former life of mine, before I came to the federal government, I was responsible for a development group that was doing PeopleSoft, and I'm not picking on PeopleSoft, but we had, because it's a specialized tool, I had 15 people tools developers. And this was for general ledger and, but our organization insisted to do things their way instead of doing it the way it was native in the tool. And they would do 3 or 4 updates a year that we would have to then go back and change because we insisted on doing general ledger different than they did. Well, there's no reason to do general ledger different than anybody else. That's a simple thing. It's not a differentiator. And had we done that, we would have saved ourselves a lot of trouble and tons of money.
Yeah, I would also add to that there's sort of 2 things that are happening right now in terms of like the paradigm shift. One is, of course, like the advent of cloud technologies and so the ability to move, with speed, with, tools that are purpose built for things that previously we would have had to do custom over and over and over again, right? So that's one. But I think the other thing that's happening, other than the technology, is this mindset shift to Agile, right? Like theoretically, you have a data center, you could do Agile development in your data center. Like there's nothing that's prohibiting, folks from doing multiple incremental releases as you, deliver a minimum viable product, and then so forth, so on and so forth, release 1, 2, 3 down the road. I think the biggest thing really is getting, the IT team as well as getting the business unit comfortable with that sort of incremental delivery, that minimum viable product approach. So I think Brent is right that like you need the requirements to really understand where you want this thing to go and where you want it to, what you want it to ultimately do. But I think looking at that as a journey rather than as an end state is super, super important. And so, one example that I can cite is just been working with Power Apps lately. So again, not picking on one technology or another, but the thinking is that you've got a common database, and then you've got these internal applications, and then you've got these external portals. Well, there's sort of 2 approaches in terms of development there. You can say, okay, well, I'm going to build the portal, and then I'm going to build the internal app, right? And that's not really the best approach, because everything in the portal could be totally done, but it's dependent on that internal application working. And so what would make sense, if moving from a waterfall approach to an agile approach, would be to say, okay, well, I'm going to do the login capability here and the login capability in the portal and in the app. And that way you've got one seamless login workflow, right? Like, okay, that's not much, maybe it's not MVP, but that's actually releasable working code, right? Because you can't do one without the other. And then maybe you say, okay, workflow 1, workflow 2, workflow 3. And so you get into a rhythm where you've got your full capabilities just continuing to mature over time, rather than one thing being dependent on the other and then nothing ever gets released or the requirements change down the road. And so I think adopting that mindset is as important as choosing the technology and leveraging the tools, as Skip had mentioned, because without that mindset, you're always going to be swimming upstream, because that's what the tools are designed to do. They're designed to facilitate that agile mindset.
I think there's a combination of between Skip and Ryan's answers that are really important to marry. Is that you do want to pick things that are native to the platforms that you're going with, but you've got to have the flexibility, to Ryan's point, in the future. So I'm not trying to pick one cloud vendor or another, but if you choose all Microsoft products and you realize that you might need to go to AWS, it's going to be really difficult. Right? You want to make sure that things operate in that multi-cloud environment. You want to make sure that you do have the flexibility. So when the agile development does require a move to maybe a different tech or a related tech, because you're iteratively progressing down your project, you want to make sure that you have the flexibility. But to Skip's point, you want to make sure that it works natively in these environments, because if you don't, you're going down a really bad path. There's a lot of nuggets of wisdom in both those answers. I just wanted to highlight the flexibility and the native operation. It's a fine line to walk sometimes, and they're not easy decisions.
Keith, did you want to add a best practice as well?
Well, I admit that I was listening to all this. I think it's pretty good. So best practice, one of the things that I've seen that's, making sure that you bring everybody together. I know we talked about collecting requirements, but making sure that it's not just a matter of kind of this sterile environment of what do you actually need. It's bringing together all the stakeholders to find out what is the totality of this. And a lot of times it's fascinating when you bring a lot of these, especially some of the more distant or less often thought of stakeholders, they bring things to the table that completely change how you actually design something going forward. So just making sure that you are as inclusive as possible on the front end, and then keep people informed as you're developing. And to Ryan's point, it's never done. If you can kind of change from traditionally in the government, we've been in this project mindset. This is when it's done and we're gone. But the reality is in cloud, you have to be in a product mindset. You are constantly iterating, constantly improving. So again, keeping all those people together to ingest what it is they want to do, and then delivering that makes you a valued partner.
Great, thank you. And this is the last call for audience questions, so please send them in before we run up against time. I had someone email me actually. So if someone wanted to get started with modernizing the cloud, like they haven't even begun the journey, what would be one piece of advice you'd give them to start off? Keith?
I'll say that the first thing, and everywhere I've gone where we've done this, is you really have to have an inventory of what's out there. A lot of times we have a tendency to focus on, whatever the top 80%, but a lot of times that other 20% are what's really eating your breakfast here. So getting a complete inventory of what do you have that you're looking at, and then picking out what is the low hanging fruit or the quick wins that you have in that group.
The other thing is, I think they have to get very clear about why they're going to the cloud. What is it that they're trying to achieve by moving to the cloud? I mean, other than mandate and checking a box, but what is the real advantage you're trying to gain? Because that'll help you decide, as Keith mentioned, what are the things that are most important to focus on, and it'll also give you a good idea if you're really achieving what you set out to do.
Yeah, I would agree with Skip. I think that vision is vital, because if you don't know where you want to end up, then you're never going to really be able to come up with the path for where you want to go. To that, I would also say that, Keith's point about the inventory and, starting with the low hanging fruit, that is incredibly valuable, because you're not going to get buy-in from the business units and possibly from the rest of the IT organization, right? If you're not able to knock some quick wins on the board, because then sort of the naysayers will just be like, see, we told you it wasn't going to work in the first place. And to that point, I would also say, like, the goal is, I think as we talked about earlier, getting to this hybrid multi-cloud kind of environment where we're able to like pick and choose what makes the most sense across the different cloud systems and SaaS providers. But at the end of the day, I would say start with one and then expand to 2 and 3, and if you even need to go beyond that. Because if you say, okay, well, we're going to go to Azure, AWS, Salesforce, whatever it is, like that just becomes far too overwhelming. So like starting small and picking one platform as at least your V1 standard, I think would line you up for success rather than spreading yourself too thin.
Along with that, Ryan, I totally agree. And so you have to know what the capabilities are of the cloud itself. And there are some differences as you go from one vendor to the other. And so you have to know what are those that are the things that you're really interested in. Learn how to do that on one, because it'll be different on another. Learn how to do that well. Do your low-hanging fruit, the pilot, whatever it is, make it work, make it be successful, and then you can put together a larger plan from there.
So my fellow panelists are making it difficult for me to be additive rather than iterative because their answers are very complete. But I would say prioritizing what you hope to, what the end state needs to be is absolutely massively impactful. When I'm having these conversations with these organizations, it's often surprising if I'm asking, well, what's your goal? Is it cost savings? Is it mission sat? Is it efficiency? Is it a better level of service for the citizenry? There are a number of different things that happen between people's ears that they generally don't communicate when they say they want to go to the cloud, right? A lot of things are assumptive on your end state, and it's not. Depending on how you want to attack the problem is really going to determine not only your overall strategy, but tactically, how are you going to take your first couple of steps, and even how are you going to requirements gather? So really painting the picture accurately for those that are in the boat with you is critically important when you're first beginning this journey.
Great, thank you so much. So we're almost out of time, and I just want to go around and have each of the panelists share one key takeaway that you either got from this discussion or you want our audience to take away with them back to their agency or their organizations. So something really key that you want to leave everyone with. And we'll start off with Skip, please.
I actually think this last question is probably the most important takeaway. You have to know what you want to get out of it. And I think that's for me the most important. What are you trying to achieve? And it should be stated in a business sense. What are we doing for the mission that we will do better or we'll be able to do that we couldn't do before? And get really clear on that as you start your journey. I think that's critical.
Thank you. And then over to Ryan.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there's just so many things to keep in mind. But I think the thing that really ties them all together is this idea of starting with the customer experience, starting with those, mock-ups, wireframes, clickable prototypes, those sorts of things. Because the experience that you find that your customers want, that really should determine everything else, including, the platform that's chosen, the way that the data model is organized, those sorts of things. So I would say starting with the customer experience, which the cloud really enables you to do, is going to lead to the greatest customer satisfaction, mission satisfaction, and then success for the IT unit. And then build your operations around that, right? So that you've got a repeatable process for consistently delivering, whether it's new applications or updates to existing applications that have been built in the cloud. That customer experience, I think, is central to all of that.
Excellent, thank you. And then over to Keith.
Yeah. Again, I'd like to have something original, but I'm going to foot stomp what Skip said earlier, that having an idea of what is it that you want to achieve, making sure that you have your collaborative stakeholders buy in on that so that you can go back and report. If we don't do that, we tend to be looked at as a cost center as opposed to a valued partner. So understanding what it is we want to achieve, and then having a report card or something we can go back and say, here's what we did, here's our progress. I think that's essential to start off with. What is that goal?
Thank you. And then over to Brent.
So I would say that the big important thing to take away here is that you're not alone. There are a lot of folks doing this exact same thing. There's folks that have done it. There are folks that have done it successfully, and there are ones that have done it not successfully. There are lessons to be learned in all of that. There are vendors, there are SIs, there are other government peers and colleagues that I'm sure are willing to share their experiences with you. To make sure you can avoid the pitfalls of previous attempts, and it can only help. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. This has been such a great discussion. I know everyone got a lot out of it. So thank you for being here. And our next panel is up next. So if our panel 2 could please come on their cameras, we'll go ahead and start with intros once again. This time we'll be discussing modernizing and improving your IT and securely manage your data. So I'll give everyone a second to come on camera and we'll go through intros. Please introduce yourself. Who are you? What organization are you with? Anything else that you would like to share with our audience up top. And we will begin with, I see 2 Ians, but I think that's Damien.
Yeah, that didn't come in right. I don't know why that's showing up that way.
I had a similar problem. If you right click, you can rename.
Yeah.
I was going to rename mine to the Batman, but I didn't.
All right, Damien, starting with you.
Oh, while I'm typing. Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Damien Kostic. I'm with USCIS. I work for the Office of Chief Data Officer. Here, we're a new shop created under relatively new legislation 2 years ago. And we're actively engaged in trying to get the agency's whole data profile all set up, standards, management tools, you name it, including trying to basically be a one-stop shop for things like BI, business intelligence, and advanced analytics type of products. AI, ML uses it. Most of the offices just aren't set up to have that kind of staff. And I'm the division chief for data analytics.
Great, it's nice to meet you. And we have ATARC board member, Ian. Ian, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes. So my name is Ian Anderson. I work with Naval Surface Warfare Center Dahlgren at their Dam Neck activity in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I'm a lead DevSecOps engineer with one of the groups there. So I've been working in the kind of DevOps, DevSecOps area for about 2 years now, in really getting the Warfare Center up to speed, some of the projects that we have up to speed on, what are those best practices. Currently, just stepped into the acting technical lead for our Warfare Center-wide software factory effort. So now taking a step from the few projects that we had that I was working on to now taking a look at how can we do this for an entire Warfare Center, and everything from the DevOps, DevSecOps best practices through those projects that want to get to the cloud, and how do we do that securely, utilizing the various offerings such as Microsoft Azure, AWS GovCloud. So a lot going on at Naval Surface Warfare Center Dahlgren.
Great, thank you. And then over to Robert.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Taylor. I'm the program manager at FEMA for supporting many of our software as a service offerings. Specifically today, I'm going to speak within my role as the Office 365 system owner, and how that relates to our software as a service offerings, how we secure those and how we make them much more applicable to our user community for accelerated release and adoption of our cloud technologies.
Thank you. And then Katie, please go next.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Katie Rose. I am with the Office of the Chief Data Officer in the Health and Human Services OIG. I'm relatively new to HHS. My background is in DevSecOps and cloud architecture. So my role is to really help bring the OCDO forward and help innovate our data architecture and our DevSecOps, DataOps, MLOps practices, and how we incorporate security, move it to the left so that we can innovate and deliver more higher velocity, higher value analytics and integrate them into our business practices.
Wonderful. And then, of course, we heard from Brent on our last panel, but Brent, for those who are just logging in, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Brent Leach. I run the public sector team here at MongoDB. I'm representing industry and the vendors that support these government agencies and these programs and projects to help them get to where they need to be as efficiently as possible.
Great, thank you all. So before we begin, I just really want to encourage the audience, please submit your questions so that we can get those answered. And as poll questions come up, which I'm about to call for one, please be sure that you respond to that in order to receive your CPE credit. With that, we'll go ahead and post our first poll question, just to get it out of the way. I'll go ahead and read it. In your opinion, how important are emerging technologies to securely managing data while undergoing the modernization of an agency's cloud? Please go ahead and respond to that, and we'll just dive right into our first question. This one is for Damien. What are some best strategies to securely manage data while undergoing the modernization of an agency's cloud?
Well, how about this? So I'm more on the business side, but I have worked on both sides of the shop. Funny enough, it seems like Katie and I actually have some similar backgrounds. I'll have to ask about that later. But yeah, I worked in the OIT shop before actually coming over to the OCDO side. Long story short is we went through a huge effort to go into the cloud, and that's been going on for years. We basically had a mandate to move everything, every single thing, including systems of record, everything up into that environment. And so I'm living with that legacy right now, just to be honest. But in part of that move, and I definitely think there's probably other people on this call that could also answer this equally well, if not better. Yes, of course, there's all these different things about, like, we'd all love to have crypto delete, available on the tech side, right? And all these other types of features, and you can create enough firewalls to shield out everything. But another way to do it, and I'm going to put this as the business spin, is that you can also create controls and security through limiting the number of copies going out there. So one of the key things we've really been emphasizing is creating a data lake structure in which we have effectively, as best as we possibly can, a zero copy environment. Everything is accessible, transparent to the agency, useful wherever you are through whatever tool, but you're not making multiple copies of that thing, right? When an agency has copies of full outputs of data sets in Excel, right, and CSV files floating on share drives and SharePoint, right, and in emails, that's bad. So long story short, right, we've been really working to keep it into one single concentrated location, zero pools, and having all the tools and everything kind of hitting it and pinging off of that, and able to do your analytics, to do your analysis, to do your production work, whatever it is, inside that environment. Yeah, and I'll stop there and point out to whoever else wants to add on to that, or however you want to work.
Yeah, that's great. One thing I forgot to mention too for our panelists, if you want to respond to a question, please come off mute. That sort of notifies me that you would like to speak. So I see Robert came off mute. Would you like to add to that?
Sure. In the context of Office 365 and our software as a service offerings there for our FEMA customers, one of the things that we've done to kind of assist with that, and similar to what Damien was saying, is we've created a solution catalog where there's solution components that are reusable, that have already been evaluated by our security team, that have already been evaluated by our Section 508 folks, right? That have already been evaluated by our privacy folks. That way, if you want to use those things, you can just pick them up and use them in a Power App or Power Automate or whatever it is. And that really, our ISO is extremely happy about that, right? Because that's, and our customer base is extremely happy about that because it's faster to market, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And the ISO doesn't have to reevaluate it, right? It's a win-win-win for everybody. It's a win for my team as well, because we know how to support it, right? We've seen it used time and time again in solutions across our Office 365 environment. So that's just one method that we use at FEMA to help kind of, address those particular concerns.
Thank you. And then Katie?
Yeah, so and a couple things I just wanted to add for specifics around things that we are leveraging and some more advanced technologies, newer technologies that we're leveraging to be able to do this, really around being able to automate the categorization of our data and the execution of governance policies against that data. Things that really were not possible in some older technologies, or would take very heavy like governance and very kind of all or nothing approaches to how we did security, are much more available now to isolate data for exactly what the uses of that data are, whether it's development or delivery. We're able to do that now with being able to categorize that data in an automated fashion and on ingestion, as well as executing automating the execution of the policies for governing access to that data. And one thing that we're also doing is separating the storage from the compute, right? So that we can really focus on what the governance around the data itself is, separately from what we need to do to that data to put it in the hands of the right people and to do the right analysis on that data.
Fantastic. All right, so Ian, what are some strategies to safely deploy applications by using multi-factor authentication and encryption of the data at rest and in transit?
Yes, so yeah, I think when you take a look at, especially within the government setting, what data you are going to, deliver to your users, or, what data your application is going to use. So, one of the things that, a lot of the government agencies are concerned about are a lot of the controlled unclassified information, PII, personal information, and things like that, as well as on the other side of, as you aggregate data together, before, where, you had different bodies that may be managing a database or managing, where that data is stored. As you aggregate that together, you get then the fun concerns of, well, if the data is together and people can see, these things together, does that change its classification? Does it need different governance policies and things like that? So moving to that kind of zero trust architecture, where you have the multi-factor authentication, is great. So that way you can apply the governance to the data and allow those to get access to what is pertinent to them. So what we try to do is, just as Damien was saying, bring all that data together. Don't make those, various copies. Oh, this database is only used for these people, so they can see this. This database is used for this, and those various things. Applying those kind of user roles, in incorporating that into the authentication. So when your data is together, you don't have to make those copies, or allow different levels of access into different areas, and then. The kind of data at rest, data in transit, for at least most of the projects and things that we do within NSWC Dahlgren, it's, a given data at rest must be encrypted, data in transit must be encrypted. But a lot of our applications and things that are being delivered out are going to, whether it be on a ship or to, somewhere else within the Navy. We don't really have that kind of public, facing types of applications.
Thanks, Ian. And Brent, I'm going to ask the same one to you. I forgot what a doozy this question was until I started reading it. So sorry, Ian, about that.
So you want to give it to me? Okay, I see.
Just if you have additional comments.
I'm going to answer it this way. There are a lot of technologies being chosen out there that are low cost or free. They may have a free version of an enterprise class tech. I would caution anyone on this path of choosing a production implementation of free or low cost, due to the fact that generally those technologies have been blessed at the enterprise version level, but the free or low cost versions often don't have the security components and the enterprise components that you would expect. So they may have encryption at rest, but I'm sorry, encryption at flight, but not at rest. And things like that. So I would caution anybody that's along this path to take a very hard look at the technologies that are being chosen. Many of those technologies are incredibly efficient. They really move you down the field much further, much faster, but they don't, often the security aspects are not taken into account when the developer or even the program manager realize that there's tremendous cost savings or efficiency to be gained. Often security is not at the forefront of that decision-making process, and they figure, oh, we can secure it later. And as anybody that is familiar with securing that data knows that securing it later is generally not the best strategy. And I'll answer it that way.
Great, thank you both. So we'll go ahead and post poll number 2, please. What is the biggest barrier to securing or to securely managing data while modernizing and improving an agency's cloud? So lots of options here: lack of clarity, budgetary constraints, misconfiguration, unauthorized access, lack of visibility, cyber attacks, insecure interfaces, and then all the above, other, or none. So please take a moment and respond to that. We have an audience question come through. It is a bit long, so bear with me while I read this. Regardless of the circumstances surrounding the move to a cloud-based solution, there are many potential security concerns that can expand the attack surface. One that comes to mind immediately is the use of web-based applications and the exposure of APIs that interface critical information over the internet. Unlike years ago, today's web applications don't just send HTML content to a browser for display, they expose APIs which enable clients to provide end users a rich application experience. All of that said, what approaches are you employing to prevent and or mitigate potential exploit of APIs? So panelists, please take a moment to ingest that question. And if you'd like to respond, just come off mute and we'll get that going.
I'll take a stab at it for how we've done that for our Office 365 environment anyway. I do manage a couple other tools that have more of a outwardly focused, community base. But fundamentally upfront, there's a couple ways you do it, right? There's the upfront and there's the in practice, right? And the upfront is, one of the things that we focus on is what data are we securing within this boundary, and how are we protecting it? Right. And one of the things that we made an early decision on upfront with Office 365 was that email for FEMA is such a mission critical system. And the communication that takes place while a disaster is being responded to is so absolutely critical to us that we decided early on that a lot of the Office 365 capabilities that allowed external users to come in, we were going to disable, right? Because we did not want to expand the attack surface of our Office 365 environment to allow a vulnerability or a threat to take down our email system, right? And render us unable to communicate during a major disaster, right? So we made that determination. And as such, right, then we had to go in and configure the environment to prevent those very things, that external access and reduce that threat surface, right? So we had to make that determination up front. But in flight, right, we also manage and monitor the use of our connections even within our internal network, right? So there's that whole thing of, hey, we're preventing externals from coming in. That's fine. That's a much more global response to those sorts of things. But there's also when folks want to when I was talking about the Power Platform earlier, right? You can connect within your internal network to pull data in from some other system. You need to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success there. Having what we traditionally, all the things that we traditionally rely on, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when we move to the cloud, right? We know how to do change management in the government, right? We've been doing it for the better part of 30 years now, right? And so what we've done at FEMA is reuse those things that we know that we're good at, but try to accelerate them, right? So when we have a customer come in that wants to build a Power App and they want to connect to another internal system, like I said, we give them those components that have already been built. We add them to the solution catalog so that they can reuse them. our ISO is comfortable with it. And that is one more thing that we know to look at and monitor the use of, right? Is that connection that we've created with our system, for example, our system that manages our deployments, right? Not software deployments, but people deployments to disasters. Are we integrating with that system, and are we doing that in a way that the system owner of that source system data agreed to do, right? And are we making sure that nothing is being used beyond that context? So, there's the upfront stuff of building out your ATO and your system boundary according to the use and the data that you intend to capture in that environment. But then also the continued monitoring, of using your change control processes and whatever tools are available in that platform to allow you to do that more technical monitoring as well.
Thank you, Robert. And Katie?
Yeah, so we actually don't have any external APIs, but really just from a usage of APIs or usage of our tools connecting to our data, I think one strategy that applies internal, external APIs or how you're doing that connectivity is what we're really trying to leverage is ABAC, that we can flow those attributes all the way through, right? So that even when someone were to make an API call, the application does what it's going to do with that. The attributes follow through with that request all the way down to the data layer, so that no matter what that API call is trying to do, the attributes associated with that request are only able to get access to the data that they should get access to. And again, it's that automation of governance policies, right? That we can execute at the data layer and not just, getting away from that model of I've got an application that sits in front of a database and that application gets just a login to the database and can get whatever data it wants, right? You compromise that API and now you have access to whatever you need. So being able to get that granularity and use something like ABAC to apply attributes for the particular request or user against the attributes of the data.
Thank you all. Any other panelists want to answer this one? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Mike, for the question. Moving on then, back to Damien, what are some best practices for monitoring and auditing workloads?
Well, I definitely would say that, one is have monitoring. It's I say that as a joke, but it is actually funny. For a long time, I feel like monitoring and having proper visibility for alerts and dashboards was the world of like the odd ITPM here and there, and other people just didn't have visibility, and that actually itself created silence. It created like pockets of knowledge, and mostly though an organization that wasn't aware of what was really going on. But by having a little bit more transparency in your monitoring, and creating those dashboards, whatever tool you're using for real time, near real time, or monthly aggregates, something, right? Getting those views out there. And we've definitely been part of data management and data quality issues, as we've been really adamant about building all those monitoring dashboards for all different aspects of the agency. So I guess in summary, say, yes, it's important. And the first step is just to remember, do it. And then from there on, you can kind of extrapolate all the different ways in which you could create those views and create alerts. One other thing that I definitely would, if I would add on anything to that, other than the platitude, is that there's the usual joke. Information has to come at the right time, at the right place, in the right manner, to the right person, right? And if you don't nail those, you've bombed it. Because right, you're going to have things slip through. And if there's been like a huge amount of work, it's in sometimes creating like white pages where you have the proper people tagged with the proper, right, for who needs to get what, when, and how. And sometimes even as far as like which time windows. So, and that goes for the whole agency, whether you're talking about leadership or staff level, whatever. But there's a whole myriad, right, collection. And you don't want to overbomb them, because that's the other problem, right? You overbomb them with information, it goes straight into that, folder in Outlook, right? For where you get dumb stuff, right? And then no one's hearing, no one's listening, right? Because it's overdose. So I guess so anyway, I don't need to summarize anymore other than say, have it, get it to the right person, the right place, the right time, right manner, right? Right, and just enough, or else everyone ignores.
Katie, go for it.
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say is to just double up on what Damien said, that that noise that you get if you don't appropriately tune your monitoring and your alerts creates fatigue that, like, if everything's a priority, nothing is, and it can be just as dangerous as not having monitoring in the first place. The second thing I would say, and more specifically to cloud, and I'm an AWS girl, so I can't speak too specifically to Azure, GCP, but I think the same principles apply, right? There's a different way to monitor and log a lot of different resources in the cloud. And I think we can kind of go down simply this path of, like, these are our standards for monitoring, and not accounting for all these different resources that are now available. New services come out all the time, right? How are we going? What are our expectations, and how do we ensure that we are monitoring any new resources that we start using, and going to the third point, in a consistent manner, so that I can actually relate that data across the different uses. So I'm going to have connectivity, and I'm going to have a path of different resources that are used all the way across a request or a usage of particular services. And I need to be able to relate my traffic from, how it comes into my VPC over to a request that was made to one of my VPC resources. And if I haven't actually formatted any of my logs, and if I haven't gotten consistency with what I expect from my monitoring data, I'm not going to be able to tie those things together and actually identify when something happens. They look like unique events that are happening in the environment, when in reality, coordinatedly, they're significant and something that we'd want to know about. So again, tune your monitoring to make sure that you have standards and you're consistent in how you monitor those different services, because they're very disparate once you start talking about cloud resources. And 3, standardize exactly what data you're getting, and make sure you can coordinate across the different data in your monitoring and your logging.
Thank you. Ian?
Yes, and well, one thing that we recently kind of talked about when it came to kind of utilizing resources, especially with the cloud, for our new enterprise-wide warfare center-wide software factory. And I encourage everyone, if you are in a government setting or in the industry setting, to collaborate with your security teams. In the government, there are the requirements for logs and various things to be retained for a certain amount of time. So as you're building out a lot of these services and you have to retain logs for, let's say, a year, you have to make sure, your security team is aware of all what's out there, what needs to be logged, and as well as, they have enough, storage space to, meet their standards, which most of the time will, within the government, go into their ATO and various things that they have to take care of on the cybersecurity side.
Thank you, Ian. And Damien, as a follow-up to your original comment, do you find it important for your DB monitoring solution to be cross-platform? And do you see any pros, cons to a cross-platform solution?
I don't see anything a problem. Actually, I'll throw this out while my colleagues were speaking. If there was anything that would be kind of germane to a concept of cross-platform that I'd throw it there. There's one thing I'd love to promote. It's using graph databases. And I only put this out in that, not that it's like graphs have been around for a long time. This is not a new topic, right, folks? But it's amazing how so many of our systems are still, right, these very bifurcated table structures and whatnot. But really, attacks don't occur, right, through one port, through one way, right, in one way, and always the same way, right? The fact is, oftentimes people observe these things because they seem like, oh, I heard this, and it's only my human brain that's putting together that I also saw this other thing over there. But, you got to leverage somehow. Anyway, I'll just put out that I think people need to take advantage of graph a little bit more without getting in details about why. Or to even discuss, what our internal parameters are. I just say in general, I think there's a lot of applications for graph that people could take advantage of explicitly for, right, looking across different platforms, but also inter and intra, right? Even intra platform, absolutely, so that you can start to find connections, right? Because a lot of whether it's data for business use or it's data from an IT standpoint, there's just too much of it, right? The human brain can't comprehend billions of actions in a given day. You need something to help sieve it. So anyway, I'll stop at that. But yes, inter. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's turn it over to Brent. Brent, what are some best practices, or I'm sorry, what are some ways to securely manage data while modernizing and improving an agency's cloud?
Sure. So there are a number of approaches, and I know that the other panelists are far more experienced in the technical aspects of securing, but I'll just talk from a strategy perspective. Very seldom does an application or an entity need all the data. They generally need a subset of the data to be effective. A strategy is identifying what data is needed for that particular mission and giving and exposing that data to those folks, but not to Damien's earlier point, to give them just enough. If you give them everything, all sorts of bad things can happen. I would also encourage paying attention to insider threat. Field level encryption is there for a reason. If you're very specifically concerned about the data in the database, not only being exposed outside, I'm sure you're exposed, nervous about things being exposed inside and then coming outside. I mean, everybody wants to avoid a Snowden situation, regardless of the sensitivity of the data. Most organizations don't want their entire data set exposed to the world, because obviously conclusions are drawn from what exists in the data set that may not be valid. Things can look nefarious if you don't understand the context of that data. So I would encourage programs and projects to make sure that they understand what data is being exposed and what data is being used, and what the purpose of that data is before they just open up the curtains entirely and let everything out.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. Any of the other panelists have insights into ways to securely manage data while modernizing and improving your agency's cloud? Ian?
Yes. So I know one thing, especially around our data that we take a look at. So when it comes to things like software factory, and you're talking to teams and you hear the word data, there's one of two things that they may be talking to: data or information that they need to run through their applications, or when they kind of generally say data, what are they doing during development, such as source code or artifacts, or data important to the development team. So when you're modernizing and moving things to the cloud, one of the things that we look at is, when we talk about access to data, but not, authentication and various things, just the literal access. Are you able to get to what you need in time? So we've kind of taken a hybrid cloud approach for our software factory that, those really important things that our development teams need will reside on our on-prem portion of that hybrid cloud. So that way, if there was an incident or something happened where we couldn't access the cloud, outside of our warfare center, our mission critical teams can still get to their source code or their artifacts to continue to do their builds and continue to do the critical work that they need to do. So I encourage everyone to kind of take a look at that side of access. What are the things that you need to have pretty much right at your fingertips if you can't get to your cloud instance, or if you can't get out to the internet? What are those things that are really critical for your organization to continue to operate?
Thanks, Ian. And Robert, maybe you can weigh in on what role does security take in this process?
This actually that's a great question, because I think it really kind of ties together a lot of the topics that we've been discussing in the last couple questions. Your security apparatus is really going to drive a lot of the requirements, things like monitoring, right? Like the cloud offers us so much data about what's going on in our environment. Like Damien was saying, sifting through all of that is near impossible for the human mind, right? You can't contextualize it. So what you got to do is work with your security team to understand what are their requirements for what they need to see versus what they don't need to see, right? Related to what Brent was saying about insider threat, right? Things that we talk to our security folks around when we implemented Power Automate on Office 365, again, to put it in one context, right? Was what do you all want to look at with the use of Power Automate that would flag a certain type of user behavior that we should be looking at, right? Do we see massive downloads of files or emails that are taking place at odd hours or you know, in odd situations by odd users, right? It's that sort of thing. I think that the security apparatus can really help you identify their requirements for what they need out of your system. And of course, up front, right? We tend to, it used to be that we treated FIPS 199 categorization at the very beginning of your ATO process, right, as a checklist, right? Let's just check the boxes and move along and get our, you know, categorization. But it's so much more critical now in the cloud environment that, you know, especially in an environment where people are deploying things rapidly, changes to applications are happening, you know, at the push of a button, right? You know, we need to know what that is, and we need to monitor against that categorization, because the moment you allow folks to kind of go off the rails and operate outside of that categorization is the moment that you begin putting yourself at risk, and your security apparatus needs to know about that.
Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, and everything Robert said, and even just at a finer level detail at an engineering level, right? Like I've been in environments where as an engineer, you get to that point where you're ready to go to ATO, and you've been an engineer. You haven't been a security person the entire time, right? So now all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of stuff that you got to figure out how you're going to meet some controls that you didn't even really understand in the first place. And I think this is, you know, this is not unique. I think there's a decent understanding that we need to shift all of that to the left, and we need to make it a part of like road mapping and architectural decision making all the way at the left. Your engineers are not going to be, unless they're security engineers, and we cannot rely on them to know exactly what they need to do to secure things. There have to be requirements that are just as important as the business requirements as to what they're developing, what they're building, and you need the right expertise on the left side to be able to explicitly tell you what those things are. And in these types of environments, what are the things that we're going to need to make sure that we're doing? And especially as, you know, cloud providers have all these new fancy features, and some of them are within VPCs and some of them aren't. There's a lot of nuance to how to keep things within an ATO boundary, how things are secure, they're not. And it's very, very easy to find those loopholes, especially when the mindset is, I just have to get my approval and then I can do the thing that I need to do, right? If we're worried about getting the approval rather than actually securing the thing, that's actually pretty easy, right? Because if your security team isn't as educated on all the nuances of all the newest technologies that are available from your cloud provider, it's very easy to just say, like, here's the name of the service, it's FedRAMPed, off we go, right? So that the mindset even of just, we're actually trying to secure this thing. We're not just trying to get the approval, we're actually trying to secure this thing. Then usually the answers to that are not necessarily an approval so much as, how do you leverage DevSecOps to really secure this thing, right? Like, how do we ensure that we're not putting vulnerable code out into the environment? And all of that comes from the left, and that understanding and agreement of, like, what is our security posture, and your engineers understanding and your architects understanding that full security posture and how it extends.
Thank you, Katie. All right, we're going to go ahead and put up our third and final poll question. And this one will be, have you and your agency fully modernized your cloud yet? So please take a moment to answer that. And then I'm just going to remind the audience to please send in their questions so that we can get them answered during this time. Okay, so Brent, in what ways can Zero Trust improve the process of modernizing an agency's cloud?
Well, Zero Trust isn't going to make the modernization any more efficient, but it certainly will make it more secure. And it's something that needs, as I said before, it's got to be something that you think about from the beginning. In the requirements gathering stage, you really need to be thinking about the security posture that you're going to pursue here. Because if you don't, if it's an afterthought, shoehorning it in later is often far too difficult. It's far too difficult to challenge. If you're going Zero Trust, make sure that your developers, everyone from the developer to the data scientist, understand that is a priority for you. Yeah, that's gonna stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anybody else on the panel? Would you like to respond?
Yeah, just real quick, I would say we're actually kind of looking forward to it. I think there's opportunities for us in what, you know, instead of that kind of all or nothing approach that was like the first iteration of the cloud, right, it can be a bit of a blocker, right? And things, if they're not explicitly secure, then they're unsecure, and so you can't get access to the things that you need to get access to, or people are doing development in the wrong places because there's no other way to get access to the things they need access to. So actually going further down that path of zero trust gives us that granularity to be able to limit the blast radius while still allowing access to things that we need to do to modernize our cloud.
Excellent. Thank you, Katie. All right. So then the next question that I have is, what are some of the best strategies to appropriately advance towards the zero trust architecture? Could we hear from Robert on this, please?
Sure, and admittedly, I have to say that I'm not an expert in zero trust architectures, but I do know this. You know, most of my experience in that realm points to knowing, especially who your admins are and who has access at the highest global level for the platforms and the services that you offer, and ensuring that you're you know, building an architecture that allows them to request the rights that they need when they need them, right? And not, you know, kind of allowing more exceptions than not, right? Because I think a lot of times what we wind up doing is we put these rules in place and then we accept the heck out of them when somebody says, but I need admin access to this, and I need, and it has to be all the time, right? You really need to have your policies, procedures, you know, in place. You need to know what those requirements are before you establish that zero trust architecture, because you are going to wind up, you know, and you need to be able to publish that and explain to people why it is they are no longer granted all the time access to everything they used to have, you know, admin access to.
Thank you, Robert. Any other panelists want to weigh in on zero trust for security? Ian?
Yes, just to kind of go off what Robert said. Yeah, you know, as you're modernizing, looking what you can take to the cloud, a lot of your workloads, whatever you know you want to do in the cloud, really work with the teams, work with your you know, security department, and find out you know, what are those things that, you know, we can stand up, and you know what, you know, whether it be APIs or portals or, you know, whatever it may be, what do people need access to, and what level of access that do we need to give to them? So when you take a look at, you know, kind of the DevSecOps approach for infrastructure as code, you know, are there services that people are requiring that they, or, you know, want admin access that we could allow them to, you know, stand them up using infrastructure as code if they need to make a change to the configuration? Can we, you know, go, you know, sit with our security office and say, hey, this is what they're suggesting. Is there any concerns? And various things like that. So, you know, we're really working closely with your security team, you know, everybody, like I believe it was Katie that said, from the developer to the data scientist, you know, we'll work with all of them to, you know, find out what is that level of access, and, you know, what are the things that you can completely shut people out of and they can still do their work, or what are those things that, yes, we do need to grant some level of access for them.
Thanks, Ian. So circling back to our poll question that was just put up, most people responded that they're currently working on their plan to modernize to the cloud when asked if they have modernized to the cloud yet. So what is a piece of advice you would want to leave our audience with in terms of how to start out, what they should be considering, or share your own experience with what you did at your agency if you've not already done so? Damien, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, actually, I was going to raise my hand because I think there's a number of things that you know, my colleagues here have all said, Katie and Robert and Ian and Brent. If there's anything to kind of synthesize in all this, is that security isn't just an IT problem, right? When you think about data management, data governance, in some cases, let's think of how wide this goes. It starts sometimes with contracting. Like, have you actually even written into a contract that the that the support personnel that you're bringing in have to adhere to agency standards, right, or to certain governance? Sometimes there's usually like a little line that says you need to adhere to your to the agency's IT, right, you know, requirements, but it doesn't really fully state it, right? And no one ever really fully comes out and gives them an, you know, for that onboarding process, a real honest to God full tilt right? Understanding of what does this really mean here. And so they're kind of left to their own to kind of figure it, and maybe someone mentions it once in a while. So long story short is that when you're doing that setup, you really got to think soup to nuts. How are you going to address security even from before people even show up on deck, right? In the contract itself, if you're going that route. And then how are you even establishing it along the route? So again, it's kind of like that right time, right place, right time, right manner kind of thing. People have to be reminded along the whole process too, right? As they're doing the development, as they're doing the deployment, as they're doing their UAT, right? It's just got to be everywhere. And also there's that, again, not just IT, there's also the business side of the fence. Again, business can help affect security profiles just as much as IT can in the way it asks and thinks about developing requirements. So long story short, again, to use that phrase, I really think people just need to really think about the whole profile. Whereas I think a lot of these questions are very much IT centric, IT focused, and maybe that's kind of the audience, but really you have to think about it as a much larger kind of paradigm for kind of holistic inclusion of security across all these different profiles.
Thanks, Damien. Great answer. Would anybody else on the panel like to weigh in on that before we move on? Robert?
Sure. Yeah, I would just throw out there for anybody that's, just jumping into the pool here, right? Try not to jump into the deep end first, right? And there's obviously danger in jumping into the shallow end. Don't break your legs either, right? But realize, and I think this goes to kind of Damien's point, right? That there could be business systems that are more ready to go, that provide the organization a lot of value, right up front, right? You'll reduce a lot of cost, maybe you improve your security, and you enable a much more kind of agile or DevSecOps release process by doing that. And that team is ready to go, and they're chomping at the bit to do it, right? Identify who in your business is ready to do that. On top of then also identifying a lot of the things that you may be offering on-prem that there is a software as a service partner to in the cloud, right? Because we do have a lot of things that we offer as just part of our IT backbone, email, SharePoint, and that stuff. And now might be the time to identify, well, is the Microsoft stack the right one for us? Or should we be looking at Google? Should we be looking at these other providers that do offer these things that we've traditionally done on-prem? Do that operational assessment that you ought to do every couple of years when you're looking at, modernizing or moving to a new platform, because it might be the time to do that, right? So especially from a custom application perspective, look at those things that you have a business partner on your business side that's ready to do it, that's chomping at the bit and is a good candidate. And then on the more IT backbone side, use it as an opportunity to evaluate, are we doing this the right way? Are we supporting the right systems? And how do we shift this current software as a service that we provide on-prem to a cloud offering?
Thank you, Robert. And Katie, over to you next.
Yeah. So the first thing I was going to say, and I think it pretty much ties into what both Damien and Robert were saying, with in a broader term, like be deliberate with it, right? Don't just like let the cloud happen to you, and don't only tackle like one of the problems that you have. You can't boil the ocean, but you also don't want to focus so tightly on one problem that you have that you're not considering the other challenges and the other solutions that you might need. And I think we realize now that if we try to at the outset determine what all the technology is going to be, then eventually that becomes outdated and we have to do this exercise all over again. So rather than kind of building out like your architecture as if it's a static thing, right? Think more in terms of frameworks and how you make architectural decisions and how you incorporate security and how it's going to grow while accommodating your most significant use cases and where you have those well-defined business requirements. But think more in terms of like a framework for how instead of like a specific what, because the what will always need to be able to change without having to start over. And then one other thing I would say, and I think this is something that usually gets kind of shoved aside for the excitement of developing, is don't forget about operating the thing. Like whatever it is you develop, whatever it is you deliver is gonna have to be operated. And in my world, that's where my biggest headaches have always come from, is when we make architectural decisions for the coolest, neatest, most innovative, the fastest way we can get something out the door, and not considering what it's going to take to actually keep this thing up and running, continue to develop against it, keep it secure. Operations they're gonna cost you just as much, if not more, as actually building the thing in the first place.
Thank you, Katie. Brent?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially with the last point. You see so many organizations that make these technological decisions early, and with the goal of getting the product out as quickly as possible, and they don't realize that the care and feeding is the expensive part. You know, it's a lot of those cheap or free technologies are free, like a free cat, right? The cat's free, but feeding that cat's going to take a lot of time and effort. The other piece is a lot of times that care and feeding changes. So keep in mind that if you do make some decisions, you really want to avoid lock-in. You want to have the flexibility. Katie's already indicated that she likes AWS. If AWS suddenly gets incredibly expensive and Azure looks a lot cheaper, the stance of staying on AWS it might be untenable. You might need to move. So make sure that you do have make decisions that allow for future flexibility. But I frankly couldn't agree with my panelist. Impossible to agree with them more across the board for the answer to this question.
Thank you all for those insights. And another audience question came through from Mike Anderson. Can you discuss your thoughts on the significance of metadata to your mission and how you approach securing it? If you would like to respond, please come off mute.
What the hey, I'll give it a shot. I would definitely say, actually, kind of to the earlier question about identifying risks. There's securing metadata, but my brain actually goes to another direction, which is utilizing metadata. You know, so oftentimes if there's risks, it sometimes shows up in the most banal places. And there's risks all kinds over the place. There's right to data quality, all kinds of problems can come in. Like sometimes, you know, you start seeing something happen in the business world, like just as a random, this is a hypothetical, but like if you start noticing the length of a given variable starts actually, for whatever reason, start getting truncated. Why did it just go from 8? It should be a standardized, the data standard is 8, and suddenly it's coming in at 7? What's going on? Anyway, long story short, there's just all these little odd things that can happen in your data, and the metadata themselves are actually sometimes more useful than the values themselves for observing and identifying and capturing things. And it might just come out to be a data quality problem, not necessarily a security problem, right? But it could, like maybe it's a hard drive starting to fail. I don't know, but there could be all kinds of things that are security, risk from other standpoints, your facilities, right? In the cloud, hypothetically, we shouldn't be worried about hard drive failures. But you could have all kinds of different types of risks that get identified in one way or another. And those metadata are extremely useful. And especially if you start using something like more of a semantic model of your data, where you're able to form and draw connections and joins between all of your disparate data, regardless if they have a explicit key defined. And that's where you start to find insights between things that seem disparate and unconnected. Anyway, so I'll pause at that one.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great response. Anybody else would like to respond to that question? Okay, well, with that, unless any other audience questions come through at the last minute, let's go around and what would you like to leave our audience with? What's some key takeaway that you either got from this discussion or anything that you want our panel or our attendees to go back to their agency or their organization with? Let's start with Damien, please.
I guess I'll harbor on one of our answers, our collective answers from a couple questions ago, which was think soup to nuts. Security is right, not just the realm of IT, and it's really across the whole organization. And it's amazing how many things the business side can actually do to help the security profile. And please don't forget that. And remember that it starts right from the beginning in terms of right before you even bring things on board. Before you even contract for things, you can put stipulations right there at the beginning that helps you set up and keep better and operate right, and keep things actually working efficiently out to the future versus just trying to get the quick win.
Thank you so much, Damien. And then over to Ian.
Yes, same thing, exactly what Damien said is, when you're getting started, you really have to consider everything, not just from the IT standpoint, but, the business side as well, especially doing something like moving to the cloud. So, I really encourage, if your organization is looking at doing this, making a plan to really bring everybody together, security, developers, those on the business side, contract side, and really discuss, what are you trying to do with the cloud? And it's pretty amazing when we brought everybody together to just do the kickoff for our software factory of a lot of the questions that you've never really considered before because you've only kind of been in the development side or only looked at it from a project standpoint and not really the whole enterprise. So that's what I want to leave everybody with is, bring everybody together. I know it's hard sometimes, especially with everybody's, now possibly teleworking, but, try to bring as many people, as many different concerns, for the idea around the cloud and how you're going to operate, and really just ask the question, what are we trying to do and what should we be concerned about?
Great, thank you. And then Robert.
Sure, I would say a lot of what we discussed today really kind of leads me back to the idea of with this brave new world, right? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We have a lot of federal practices that we have lived with for many years. We may be getting asked to accelerate them, right, and do them faster. But things like our NIST controls and security and all that stuff that we were talking about with system categorization, that's all still important, and it will actually enable you to do these things better, right? Your DevSecOps, the sec piece of that DevSecOps, right? Doing all that stuff early upfront, knowing what your data is, knowing how you're controlling it, building your change control processes in play and utilizing those that probably already exist. Again, you may be getting asked to do them faster, but they probably already exist and help you kind of update your security documentation, keep your ISOs informed. All of that stuff is still critically important. And I think, all we're being asked to do now is like I said, do it faster, but don't throw it all away, right? And I don't think you're being asked to throw it away. Still live by it, but we all have to navigate this and do it together. Whether you're on the industry side of things or on the government side of things, figure out how to work together to accelerate that for your business units.
Thank you. And then over to Katie.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is a big part of like my approach and strategy, no matter what it is I'm working on, and especially that's enabled by cloud, enabled by DevSecOps, is collaboration, right? And when we talk about business requirements, we talk about it's not just IT. I think we have a lot more capabilities now for that than we ever really did before. We have the ability to, like I said, build frameworks where we can operate within that framework, stay secure within that framework, but really enable different parts of the business to facilitate and work according to their priorities in collaboration with IT to innovate more quickly, to develop with higher velocity, get to production faster, because they're not competing with IT's priorities for whatever other things that they have, right? So I would encourage you to take advantage of the collaboration where it's possible and build that ability to collaborate into your architectures, into how you structure your infrastructure code, into how you gather your security requirements and implement them, right? Like, how do you ensure that in that collaboration, nothing's going to happen to your ATO boundary when you have someone who's over, like me, in the CDO office trying to write from infrastructure code and send it out to production? How do you keep me from making an S3 bucket public, right? Like those are things that you really need to make sure that you lock down, but you can get a lot of value out of collaboration when you allow the work to be done according to the priority and the ownership of delivery for what needs to be done. Otherwise, that competing priorities between IT and business units is one, I think, like for the ages, right? That can really kind of stifle innovation according to like exactly what the funding is and what the priorities are and what the outcomes that are expected are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And then Brent, we'll have you wrap it up.
Sure. What I would like everyone to leave with is you're not alone in trying to meet these challenges. There are lots of agencies, programs, projects, business units that they're trying to solve these same problems. Some of them have attempted already. Some of them done it very well. Some of them have not done it well. There are a lot of vendors. There are a lot of systems integrators, and you have a lot of peers and colleagues throughout the entire government that are trying to address these problems. Don't go it alone. Everyone is smarter together than they are apart. So look at the pitfalls that others have fallen into, so that you may avoid them going forward. The folks that have a more broad view are those outside vendors and SIs. Find a couple you can trust, but always get a second opinion on ways to solve these problems because they are surmountable. Nothing is daunting, but they are surmountable.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great way to wrap it up. So I want to thank everyone again, our panelists, and of course, our partners at AWS, DB Mongo, and Carahsoft for helping us create today's summit. And I want to thank you all at home for joining us, and thank you for sending in your questions, really help form the conversation. Join us next time for our October 21st, How to Improve Federal Mobile Security Ecosystem. That should be a really great one, so you can go register for it now. And with that, I hope everyone has a great rest of their week and talk to y'all soon. Bye.